Every alien civilization remembers the day the Deathworld Humans stopped showing mercy. Voth Kalima hated paperwork. Not in the abstract way most sentient beings hate paperwork, the way you hate traffic or taxes. He hated it specifically, personally, the way you hate a coworker who chews too loudly. 23 years cataloging incident designations for the Interstellar Concord Archive, and he still hadn't found a filing system that made this job less miserable. But today's file was worse than miserable. Today's file was designation Human Mercy 0, and Voth had been putting off summarizing it for 3 weeks. He poured himself a cup of fermented zeth root, the good stuff he saved for occasions requiring emotional fortitude, and opened the report. Right, he muttered to the empty office. Let's talk about the humans. Everyone in the galaxy had an opinion about humans, and almost none of it was accurate. They lived on a planet that actively tried to kill them on a near-daily basis with weather, wildlife, and each other, and somehow they had emerged from that crucible not as the raging berserkers you'd expect, but as the single most patient, restrained, aggravatingly reasonable species anyone had ever negotiated a treaty with. They took prisoners. They offered surrender terms to pirates who didn't deserve them. They de-escalated conflicts other species would have solved with orbital bombardment. The Concord had nicknamed them, with equal parts affection and confusion, the patient predators. It was meant as a compliment. It was also, Voth now understood, a massive miscalculation. Because the thing about patience is that it implies a limit. Nobody had bothered to find out where humanity's limit actually was. Until New Callaway Station. New Callaway was, by every metric the Concord tracked, a model colony. A joint human-alien mining operation orbiting a gas giant nobody had bothered to name properly, home to 11,000 souls across 4 species. It ran on human administration, Ketheri engineering, Ulmarai logistics, and a general policy that had become so famous it got its own footnote in Concord diplomatic literature: no first strike. Colonel Renata Ashworth Voss ran the station with the exact energy you'd expect from someone who'd survived 2 tours of actual warfare and decided the rest of her life would be spent making sure nobody else had to. She had a laugh you could hear 3 corridors away and a policy that even armed raiders got a chance to surrender before anyone got hurt. Her logistics officer, a stubborn, good-humored man named Marcus Whitlock, liked to joke that the colonel would offer a peace treaty to a supernova if it asked nicely. Dessa, the station's lead Ketheri engineer, found this whole human philosophy baffling and, honestly, a little terrifying in its own way. Her species had a saying: the gentlest hand belongs to the one who knows exactly how hard it can hit. She figured humans understood that saying better than anyone. She just hoped nobody ever tested it. Someone tested it. The Skarn Combine had been raiding the outer trade routes for 6 years, and they had built their entire operating model on one core assumption: humans don't fight back the way you'd expect. Hit a human colony, and you get negotiation, not retaliation. You get an administrator offering terms. You get a species that treats mercy like a policy instead of a weakness, which, to men like Combine Warlord Grethak Bone, was functionally the same thing. They hit New Callaway during a supply lull, when half the defense fleet was escorting an ore shipment 3 systems away. Textbook opportunism. Grethak brought 4 raider cruisers and enough confidence to choke a sun. The other species on the station knew better than to relax. The Ulmarai quietly began evacuation protocols the second the raiders dropped out of warp. Dessa remembered watching a young Ketheri technician, barely out of training, ask her if the humans would negotiate. They always negotiate first, Dessa told her. That's the policy. Is that good? Dessa didn't answer, because she genuinely didn't know anymore. Grethak requested a parley, expecting the usual song and dance. Ashworth Voss agreed, because that was the policy, and policies exist to be followed even when your gut is screaming at you not to trust the man on the other side of the table. The gut was right. Mid-negotiation, with a ceasefire technically in effect, Grethak's forces opened fire on the civilian docking ring. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even necessary. It was a demonstration, the kind of casual cruelty raiders use to remind everyone who holds the leverage. Marcus Whitlock died pulling 2 children away from a collapsing bulkhead. A Ketheri family, 3 generations who had lived on New Callaway since its founding, died in the corridor outside the docking ring because the humans had insisted, as policy, that families be allowed to shelter near the negotiation zone instead of the militarized sections. Mercy, it turned out, could be exploited. Gretac had counted on exactly that. Ashworth Voss watched it happen from the command deck feed. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry, not then, not where anyone could see. She said 4 words to her tactical officer, and those 4 words would end up quoted in Concord military academies for the next decade. The policy is rescinded. Voth, reading the transcript 20 years later in a quiet archive office with cold tea and a headache building behind his eyes, found himself laughing. Not because it was funny. Because it was the only reaction left when you realized exactly what those 4 words meant, and exactly how long humanity had been holding something back out of pure, deliberate choice. What followed over the next 6 hours was, according to every surviving Concord officer who watched the sensor logs, the single most efficient military operation any of them had ever witnessed, and also the most quiet. No monologuing. No warning shots. No demands for surrender, because the offer of surrender had apparently expired the moment Gretac's forces broke the ceasefire. Human strike craft that had spent years flying defensive, restrained patterns suddenly moved like they'd been holding back a completely different doctrine the whole time, one built by people who understood exactly how much force it takes to end a fight permanently rather than temporarily. An Ulmari sensor tech aboard the Allied relief fleet, arriving 4 hours too late to matter, reported that the human pilots weren't communicating with each other much at all. They didn't need to. Whitlock's own logistics division, gutted with grief, rerouted power grids and coordinated strike windows with the kind of cold precision that made Dessa, watching from an engineering bay, feel a chill she couldn't entirely blame on the station's failing environmental controls. One human gunship commander, call sign unclear in the official record, was recorded saying a single line over an open channel before disabling a Skarn cruiser's reactor core with what analysts later called an almost insulting economy of firepower. You had terms. You chose this instead. That was it. No threat, no fury, just a statement of fact, delivered the way you'd point out someone had made an obvious mistake on a form. Voth found that somehow more unsettling than any battle cry could have been. Anger burns out. This didn't sound like anger. It sounded like a decision that had already been made and finalized, with the fighting simply being the administrative follow-through. Aboard Gretac's flagship, the mood had shifted from triumphant to something closer to a slowly dawning nausea. His sensor officer, a Skarn named Utheg who would later be one of the only survivors willing to testify to the Concord, reported watching 3 of their 4 cruisers go dark within the first hour, not destroyed spectacularly, just methodically shut down, boarded, or gutted with a precision that felt less like combat and more like an exterminator dealing with an infestation. Gretac, to his credit, tried to reopen communications. He offered terms. He offered a retreat. He offered, in his final recorded transmission, an apology, which under any other circumstance might have actually worked, because if there was one thing everyone knew about humans, it was that they listened to apologies. There was no response. The channel simply stayed open, silent, until his flagship's reactor took a single, precisely placed hit that ended the transmission along with everything else. Voth paused his reading here and took a long drink of his Zeth root, because even secondhand, even decades later, there was something about the silence in that final transcript that made his skin want to crawl right off his bones. The galaxy had spent generations calling humans predators and meaning it as a compliment, a cute nickname for a species that chose not to use its teeth. Nobody had considered what it would look like if they simply decided the leash was optional. By the time the Allied relief fleet actually arrived, there was nothing left to relieve. The Skarn Combine, as an organized fighting force, no longer existed in that sector. What remained were 3 drifting hulks, a scattering of survivors who surrendered the instant they were given the chance, and a human colony that had won so completely there wasn't even a victory to announce, just a very long, very quiet cleanup. Ashworth Voss did not celebrate. There was no parade, no announcement of triumph beamed across Concord networks. She stood in the ruined docking ring 3 days later, in front of what remained of her station's population, and gave a short address that Dessa recorded on her personal device without really meaning to, the way you sometimes hold on to things without knowing why yet. "We had a policy," Ashworth Voss said, her voice steady in the way voices get when steadiness is the only thing holding a person together. "The policy existed because we believed most conflicts don't need to end in graves. I still believe that. But I need every person on this station, human or otherwise, to understand something clearly. That policy was a choice. It was never a limitation. We are rebuilding New Callaway. We are also revising several assumptions about what mercy costs, and who gets to spend it." Dessa lost 4 colleagues that day, including the young technician who'd asked if the humans would negotiate. She spent the following months rebuilding half the station's environmental systems from scratch, and somewhere in that grinding, exhausting labor, she came to a conclusion she never quite said out loud to anyone but herself. She was grateful the humans had been there. She was also, for the first time in her long career working alongside them, quietly terrified of what she'd learned they were capable of, and had simply chosen, up until that day, not to be. Back in his office, Voth reached the final section of the file, the part he always found the most darkly amusing, because it was the part where the rest of the galaxy caught up to something the survivors of New Callaway already knew firsthand. Within a month, 17 separate Concord member governments quietly filed requests to revise their standing threat assessments on humanity. Diplomatic corps across a dozen systems spent frantic weeks rewriting protocol manuals that had, until then, cheerfully assumed human restraint was a permanent, load-bearing feature of the species rather than a courtesy extended on a case-by-case basis. The nickname patient predators quietly, almost sheepishly, fell out of official use. Nobody wanted to be the diplomat who kept using the old, inaccurate branding. The replacement nickname took a while to settle, cycling through several unofficial candidates before the one that finally stuck emerged from, of all places, a junior Ulmarai trade delegate who'd simply been trying to describe the situation accurately in a memo. She called them the Forgiving Storm, on account of the fact that they extended forgiveness generously and repeatedly, right up until the exact moment they didn't, at which point what followed had all the negotiable qualities of actual weather. Voth found this both accurate and, in the specific way only a career archivist could appreciate, extremely funny. He typed it into his summary without changing a word. He finished his tea. He finished the report. He sat for a long moment looking at the closing line he'd have to submit, the one every Concord official reading this file would eventually skim past on their way to the next incident, the next crisis, the next species they'd inevitably misjudge. He typed it anyway, because someone should, and because if there was one thing 23 years in this job had taught him, it was that the galaxy had a truly stubborn habit of learning the same lesson over and over, usually right after ignoring the last dozen times someone tried to write it down. "Humanity will offer you every reasonable chance to walk away," he wrote. "Best to take one of them. They are not, technically, keeping count of how many you've used. They just tend to remember." He closed the file, poured one more cup of Zeth root, and made a note in his personal calendar to check, in a few years, whether anyone had actually listened. His money, as always, was on no.